This is a question that I ask very often. And what is your immediate thought when you are asked, where are you from? Do you think of the place that you were born? Do you think of the place that you grew up? Do you think of the place that you live now? And then, what do you answer? My immediate answer usually is, do you mean my accent, where I'm originally from? Or do you mean where I live now? Do you mean where is my home? And where is your home? Which is the place that you identify with as your home? The many definitions of home place discuss physical and non-physical attributes of home. Let's start with the physical ones that are the first three. When you think of your home place, do you see a place with river and trees? Do you see mountains? Do you see busy city street? And then where is this place? Is it the place that you grew up, born, live now? And then let's move to the social attributes of non-physical attribute of home place. Do you hear certain sounds? Do you smell or taste certain foods? Do you think of family? Do you think of friends? And then again, where is this place? As an architect and an urban planner, I was fascinated by the notion of home place and how it's shaped who we are. Clearly, you would be a different person if you grow up in an island, and this is what you would see from your window, or if you grew up in a big city, and this is what you would see from your window. Are we going to be different people if we grew up in an architectural masterpiece? Or if we grew up in a communism-era apartment building where everything is identical and everybody is equal? And what if you grow up in a house that nobody designed and where no planning or infrastructure exists? But it's not only the housing unit itself, the dwelling unit, it's also the immediate built environment. Because the social structure of the community is influenced by the physical attribute of its social center. And so the environment that we grow up in is actually affects who we are and the social group that we form. But what happens when the environment changes? Clearly, when there's going to be built a new structure here, there's going to be no more trace to this old unit that stood here before. But what about us? What effect these changes made on us as an individual, as groups? So in search for an answer, I started with the Navajo nations, where I was interested to see if a housing project in urban subdivisions can place possibly the traditional home unit of the Navajos, the Hugan. Housing subdivisions were built in the Navajo Nation since the 1960s. However, when you travel in the reservation, you don't only see abandoned hugans like this one, but also new ones that built exactly according to the traditional laws of the older ones. Some of them are built for traditional ceremonies and can be performed only in a hugan. Others are built as a primary dwelling unit of the families who wants to live the Navajo way of life. So when you go around the reservation, you can find many different hugan shapes serving many different purposes. However, most of the Navajo people live in these housing subdivisions where they actually lost the sense of identity, pride, ownership that they used to have in their traditional home unit, the hugan. So interestingly, public building in the reservation, in an intention to instill pride and identity, borrowed this shape of the hugan so as to instill also comfort, security, which was further adapted by the Catholic Church, who also borrowed the shape of the hugan to gain more Navajo followers so that they would feel more at home in the churches. Even the Basha supermarket used hugan as its logo. So basically, while there are new houses being built in the reservation, I'm sorry, the hugan cannot be abandoned because more than a structure, it embodies the Navajo tradition and Navajo life. And interestingly, the same concept of having a traditional home unit adjacent to a modern one, we can find in the other side of the world the Bedouin community in the Negev region of Israel, where you see traditional tents building in town, near a town unit, and also serve as a place for social gathering in government-planned towns. The Bedouin dwelling unit was considered the women domains, and these tents, we can still see them today throughout the Negev region in Israel. Particularly, we can see all kinds of variation of this type of traditional temporary dwelling of the Bedouins. At the same time, there were towns planned for the Bedouin. However, most of them refuse to move into this government-planned town, and they stay in this temporary structure with no amenities, no infrastructure, because they believe that in these traditional places, this is where they can still practice their tradition, their livelihood that they're used to, something that cannot be done in the cities where there is a big mismatch between the rate of change of the built environment and how the traditional norms are changed. And so when they need to still have camels, they still raise sheep, all are being raised in a town unit, and so as a result, this town unit became a cramped, a crowded space that, like the case of the Navajo, lost all sense of identity that the Bedouin had in their culture. And of course, those who are affected the most are the women, where this tent used to be their place of employment and place of dwelling. So while in the unrecognized villages, women can still do some of their traditional work, not anymore weaving for the tent, but for other purposes. In the town, they have to organize, to get together and perform these traditional jobs. And this organization, the center of it, is placed in a traditional tent so as to instill in these women sense of pride, sense of tradition, so that they can easier get into the modern life. So the Bedouin tent and the Navajo hugans are both not just a structure. The Bedouin tent serve as women's social gathering and social place. The Navajo is the center, Hugan is the center of their traditional religions. And so these two examples are examples of traditional communities that are in process of development and demonstrate that the importance of home place is something that cannot be glossed over by development, and we should take care of these things very carefully. Both the Navajos and the Bedouins were nomads. So were the early Israelites. However, it occurred to me that my dad was also a nomad. He was a nomad of the modern Jewish history of World War II. So these images were taken in the first home that my dad and his sister had after they traveled 5 years from 1939 to 1944 through Europe with their mom fleeing the Nazis. However, they had a previous home and previous life with happy memories and happy life. And so the memory of this previous home where this happy life occurred was etched in the 5-year-old that was forced away from it. And so, about 65 years later, he went to look for it. And he cried like the 5-year-old that he was when he saw the number 18 of the house. And then he continued crying when he went to the backyard, looking up, remembering the place where he used to feed the birds. And then he wanted to see the neighborhood, where they have happy memories as a family. He wanted to take a picture in the exact same place, try to figure out if this is really the exact same trees, try to figure out if this is really the exact same place that they used to go. Is it here? Is it there? And then a few years later, it was my turn. After researching the Bedouin home, the Navajos, after building home in Israel and then building home in Los Angeles, I was ready to learn more about my grandparents who were never able to feel at home in Israel, to which they immigrate out of necessity, not out of choice. And so I started a touristic tour of Krakow. My dad was the guide, and the first stop was this synagogue, which is the biggest Jewish synagogue in Krakow that was renovated after the war. It used to be horse stables for the Germans. And I was surprised to learn that his grandmother lived just across the street from this synagogue. So when I went in, it was not anymore tourist attraction. It was my great-grandmother neighborhood. It was where she lived. It was where she prayed. And I thought, where was she sitting? What was she thinking? How often did she come here? After all, she lived just across the street. And so I went across the street trying to figure out and to see more about this place that used to be hers. It used to be part of my family. And when the door opened, I went up to this dilapidated, smelly staircase, still neglected by the communism, tried to figure out where did she live. Went up, went down, begging my dad to remember, but he didn't. He, after all, was a 5-year-old. And so it was now my turn to take a picture in front of the building, still excited from the idea that my own great-grandmother lived just across the street from this great remains of the lost Jewish community of Krakow. And then he took me to his house. And without even noticing, he said, you see, this is where I live. And the place was renovated since the last time he was there. But we were still able to get in while I frantically take notes of everything that happened, of the entrance, of the backyard, of the place that he used to feed the birds. But the most interesting was to try and figure out how this 3 little communism-era apartment building were used to be once the great home that my dad remembered, the big apartment. And so we also went down trying to think, how did it look from the street? And how did it match the whole plan that I just did? Does it? And so while standing there in the places they live, in the spaces they occupied, I imagined my grandparents walking in these streets, beginning to better understand why they had such difficulties in building the new home in a totally different culture and a totally different environment. And I wanted to learn more about this pre-war Jewish life, Jewish homes in Europe. And so I discovered the Bardejov Jewish Preservation Committee. This is a non-profit organization that is dedicated to restoration and preservation of Jewish sites in a small town in Slovakia. And so between the island and the city and the Navajo homes and the Bedouins, I realized that what interested me the most is to find more about the Jewish home of my ancestors. And indeed, this little town of Bardejov had a small, neat Jewish community that had a very big Jewish center. It was called Jewish Suburbia, and it's recognized as a UNESCO Historical World Heritage. There were synagogue and mikveh and bet midrash, which is a school, and this place is now in a process of renovation and restoration. Adjacent to it, there is a memorial built, a memorial to the Jewish life that ended, a memorial to the community that disappeared. How interesting it is that the architect used the facade of this memorial to look exactly like the houses that was there, the Jewish houses that were adjacent to this Jewish suburbia. So today there are no more Jews in Bardejov, and it's unlikely that any of these descendants or survivors will call this place their home again. However, the buildings, they serve as an important memory to what was once the big Jewish community of Bardejov. And in my current work, my current job, I'll help these people reconnect with these memories, with the memories of the houses, with the memory of their homes, so as they would be able to feel more connected to the new homes that they feel that they built all around the world, so they could be more whole again. Because home is much more than just a structure or a physical thing. Home is culture, home is sense of belonging, and home is who we are. Thank you.